Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today for our second lecture in the MEDLAW Learning Below the Surface series. If you weren't here last week, I'll just reintroduce myself. My name is Carly Oakson, and I'm a pediatric emergency medicine physician at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Emory University School of Medicine. It's been so wonderful collaborating with everyone and the Stephanie V. Blank Center in this initiative to provide medical education to the legal community about important topics that impact your legal cases. Today, we have such an important topic on maladaptive personality styles that can impact high conflict litigation. The cause and the source of the conflict might not always be apparent, and so further understanding the underlying psychology of these personality styles can help contribute to these cases. And so I'm very happy to have our two presenters here. We're Dr. Ramani and Jason Ross. The first part of the talk will be from Jason Ross and then followed by Dr. Ramani. So I feel honored to introduce them and tell you more about their background. I'm gonna start with Jason. So Jason Eric Ross is a licensed psychotherapist in Georgia, New York, and Florida. He's the son of two psychoanalysts, and he has trained in school and community psychology. He's worked in both chronic mental health, addiction treatment, and now in private practice for many years. He specializes in treating trauma, parenting, and lifestyle, and is frequently sought for his expertise on media platforms. He co-wrote You Can Say No to Your Children and They Will Still Love You with his mother, Norma. He's also an actor and a writer, and he's been a script supervisor for the Mind of the Murderer program and portraying Keith Jesperson on Evil Lives Here. And then Dr. Ramani Durvasula, she is a licensed clinical psychologist in Los Angeles, California. She's the professor emerita of psychology at California State University, Los Angeles, and the founder and CEO of Luna Education, Training and Consulting. There's a company focused on educating individuals, clinicians, and business institutions on the impact of narcissistic personality styles. She's also authored 2 books on narcissism and narcissistic relationships, and her new book on healing from a narcissistic relationship will be released in September 2023 by Penguin. I know I'm really excited and looking forward to this talk, so let's get started.
Okay, guess we'll take it away. Okay, if we're at any point when I'm talking, you actually hear something funny, and I can actually see you. I know I have the screen right now. You can raise your thumb up if you thought you heard a good joke. Other than that, this is going to be somewhat didactic, somewhat basic, but I think these concepts are the most helpful in terms of what we really need to understand. On the screen, you probably see right now the power and control wheel. This is the basic document that a lot of therapists will end up giving a client who's in an abusive relationship. And again, when we're talking about personality disorders per se, and I'm going to stay away from the technical aspects of personality disorders. More so, I'm going to focus on behaviors that we see. It's good to give credence to diagnoses, and at the same time, for some diagnoses, you need, let's say, 5 out of 9 criteria. What happens if you're missing one of the 5 and you only have 4? You know, you have to still deal with the behaviors, and in courts, we're dealing with the families. It's something I've seen a lot of, both in my practice in New York and certainly in my practice in Florida. I'm going to talk about just a handful of topics today, and I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what those labels will be. Batman, which is very important to my discussion. For those of you who have seen the Christopher Nolan Batman films, it'll make a little more sense. What the core of narcissism is, why abusers need an object, what projection looks like, common traits that we see in the office, and how consequences play in. I'm not sure how many, I can't see a lot of the hands right now, but if anybody's seen the Christopher Nolan Batman films, particularly the one known as The Dark Knight, that is the famous film with Heath Ledger playing the Joker. And the relationship between the Joker and Batman is very unique. In fact, probably across any set of comics, comic book characters historically, it is the most consistent relationship because it goes on and on and on. And there's never any annihilation of the other one. There's a very famous scene in The Dark Knight where Batman is actually interrogating the Joker. And he says the following. I can do it with the voice, but it'll sound a little different. He basically says to the Joker, "Why do you want to kill me?" And Christian Bale says that, and Heath Ledger responds, laughing as he usually does, because he's the Joker. He says, "I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers?" At that point, Batman realizes something that he never understood. The Joker needs him. And later in that scene, he actually says, "You complete me," which harkens to the Tom Cruise movie many years ago with Renee Zellweger. The fact is, he needs him because without him, he dies in a way. And narcissism is very unique in that the person can die a psychic death. It's almost a death of the ego. And this scene reveals that he's not going to kill Batman, and he has to keep this going. There's a later scene after this interrogation where basically Batman apprehends the Joker, and the Joker's response to all that is, "You won't kill me out of some misguided self-righteousness, and I won't kill you because you're too much fun. We're going to do this dance forever." That's really an interesting dynamic. He can't give it up. What I've seen in private practice, particularly in cases that I know even personally, the abuser, and for all intents and purposes, I'm going to discuss it as narcissistic personality disorder, they need that object. They need somebody to be connected with and to dole out the abuse. Now, if you look at the power and control wheel, well, that's how it's usually played out. And I think keep this in mind just towards the end of what I'm going to discuss, because this is what I believe from a clinical perspective is getting missed too often in the system. The perpetrator does this, what we see on the wheel, in different ways. And physical violence is what we are most attuned to, I believe. And it's certainly egregious to say the least. But the fact is, there are subtle ways to do it. Financial and emotional coercion are huge. And major damage is done. So for our intents and purposes, what I'm going to say to you now is that Joker is the abuser. His job is to continue to coerce Batman, harass him, hook him in. And that's what he does actually through any version of the comic series. That's what he does. That's what an abuser typically looks like, in my opinion. They actually can't give it up. One of the best signs you can see in let's call it a high conflict situation. And by the way, my contention is, you always hear this phrase, "It takes two." Actually, no, it just takes one. And the one person who has been hurt, their ego has been hurt, their narcissistic injury has happened, they're going to take it out on the person who exposed it. It's that basic to me, that's how they go. And for most of the cases that I've ever dealt with, that's the continual situation. I have a friend who's in now the 4th+ year of divorce proceedings. I say that with the caveat that she was divorced about 2 years ago. So you think, well, why didn't it end? Because the moment the abuser in this case gives this up, he's going to have to move on. And I think it's a very big sign for any court to watch what the person does, whoever the abuser is, what they do outside of the court, what they do on, let's say, the family chat, family wizard, etc. But you can see how often they do these things. The moment they want out of the relationship, they and they are going to give up the abuse, you're going to see a change. So I just want that as a little bit of background. The relationship is about control. And yes, you can have violence, but giving up control is very interesting, particularly for someone who I'm going to describe as narcissistic. Okay? So when they give it up, we're going to see that. So what's the core of narcissism? Well, certainly there's different theories about it. I happen to be the son of not one, but two psychoanalysts. You can feel free to make whatever jokes you need later, or you can make them now in the chat. It's an interesting way to grow up when you're constantly surrounded by Freud. I had a whole library of Freud books in my house. That's not what I would call average, or at least normal. So I've had a little more exposure to this, and I think my father's thesis was actually on narcissism. So narcissism generally comes out of a lack of esteem. It can come out of abuse, but at the core of it, there's a lack of self-worth and self-esteem. How that plays out can play out a lot of ways, but generally in the abuser, and I'm going to, again, that could be the person with a cluster of symptoms, different diagnoses across the spectrum of personality disorders. The bottom line is there's something unfulfilled in them. What do they do with that? Well, typically they need an object. They need somebody to torment. They need somebody to take it out on. I believe that's where the problems really come in. Because what seems to be getting missed in my view is that when children are involved, which is most cases, when children are involved, they are a function of the abuser. They are a function of the abuser in my view. So if, let's say, the abuser is the father, he controls the mother, the self-esteem of the children is directly related. And generally speaking, I find that the children have so much to work through. It's almost like intergenerational trauma. It keeps repeating, and it keeps happening. So long as the abuser, and I'm going to call it the narcissist in this case, is allowed to execute what we see on the wheel of power and control, we have to keep repeating it. So in essence, there's no rest for the weary. And it's usually the parent who has custody. That's usually what I've seen. It's usually the parent who has custody. And it's this constant sort of tormenting. And it just keeps going on. Imagine somebody doing this to your head all day long. That's generally what most people say. In private practice, one of the worst things I've learned, unfortunately, is that people who've been emotionally abused very often wish they had been physically abused. They say that in terms of, at least I would have known that I mattered. Emotional abuse is subtle, but extremely powerful. Someone with a personality disorder, and particularly, again, just because you have a personality disorder does not mean you're going to be an abuser. But in the court system, I think that's generally what we're seeing. Most of the high conflict divorces. Now, can you have two parents with personality disorders? Sure, of course. And they're going to be more conflictual, and that's even worse for the child because the child feels they have to pick sides. But once the abused breaks free of the abuser, you start to see a real shift in the dynamic. The abused person generally has exposed the person with the personality disorder. That's at the core of it. And that's pretty much anathema to someone with a severe personality disorder. Exposing their weaknesses, exposing their insecurities, that narcissistic injury is really at the base of everything. You can almost trace back all the abuse. In one case that I've had, basically the father's infidelity, mishandling of finances, and complete disregard for the family unit was exposed. What happened after that? He's basically spent the last 4 years tormenting and abusing his ex-wife. And this includes after they've actually legally been divorced. That's powerful stuff, because what the child learns, and particularly a child who's going, let's say, through young adulthood, puberty, that's a very formative time. So from my clinical standpoint, I watch that if the parenting doesn't get put into check, we have a problem. My issue with it from a clinical standpoint is who can put the limit on the parent who is executing what is in this wheel. That's really what it boils down to. And using the children as bait, calling out the other parent, that kind of abuse really goes a long way with the children, and not in a good way. So at that point, what does the parent have to do? They have to be more mindful of how they speak about the other parent. They have to decide, well, can I put my child into therapy? The problem with that, of course, is that children don't want to go to therapy. I find that fascinating, by the way, that most parents will say to me, well, how come my child doesn't want to go to therapy? And I always respond, well, most of the time I respond thinking, well, do you want to go? You know that you go because it's good for you. But to a child, this is not something they want to do. They want to go play with their friends. They don't want to be caught in their parents' problems. They don't want to listen to their parents argue. They want a fantasy until that fantasy is broken. So something to consider. Projection. Okay, projection. One of the core tenets of Freudian philosophy and theory. So what will typically happen? The abusing parent is going to project what they've done wrong onto the other parent. Once they've been exposed, they're going to try to make the other parent look like the bad person. They will do it in multiple ways. As an example, a parent could cut off some economic aid. What will they do? In essence, and I'm paraphrasing and I'm taking a little poetic license, but basically what they're going to do is they're going to accuse the other parent of doing what they did. And they'll gaslight, and you're going to hear that term probably for the next 100 years daily, I believe. I think gaslighting has become the, I don't want to say it's the flag of the narcissist, but I think that's a fair way to say it. They're going to gaslight the other parent, and that's where the projection happens. So they're going to put their insecurities and their misdeeds onto the other person. I think that's the definition of projection that I would use. The narcissist, for all intents and purposes, does not want to acknowledge their own insecurities because, again, it's a very painful experience, possibly one they had happen multiple times in their childhood, which really develops a high level of shame. The interesting thing, which no one quite understands completely, is what gets somebody to turn to where they become more narcissistic and more abusive versus people go through trauma all the time and they'll never abuse anybody. Personality, I believe, is under that. It's a really fascinating detail. My experience of, ironically, having worked with Discovery ID channel and being on multiple murder recreation shows, which is a very interesting way to spend your day, has shown me that the level of pathology that the humans are capable of and what a narcissistic personality disorder, as an example, looks like. I think what we're seeing, and my colleague can certainly attest to this much more so, personality disorders, for all intents and purposes, we're seeing them more frequently. We're seeing more behavior more frequently. You hear the terms gaslighting more often. You hear the terms borderline personality disorder. You hear it a lot more in common society. So we've always often wondered, well, is it that we have more of it, or is we're just seeing it more? Which one is it? It's an interesting question to think about. The last thing I really want to touch on today is sort of the traits that we see. I could almost boil it down to, well, the wheel of power control. That's one way to do it. For families where there's a family wizard app, which I guess would be, the bulk, I think you can find most perpetration in the app itself. So things we see across the board. So there's bullying of different types. The behavior in court is very interesting. Court behavior is very interesting. The parent who paints the other parent poorly will do it in court. They will do it in the app. What will they do besides projection? The victimization. They will make it look like they were the ones who were done in, even though they're the ones who were actually the perpetrator. I think what people can look at the most is watching how one spouse talks about the other one. I think that's one of the most salient features. I find the more that one parent badmouths the other, it's a real telltale. I tend to find, again, this is just my own experience, one parent does most of the bad mouthing. One parent tries to do the right thing. It's very hard to level that unless people in the court are taking it in and deciding to look at it more critically. And again, there's different levels of sociopathy, psychopathy. The greater the level, the less a chance the person's going to care what happens. I have a friend and a colleague who once said, best thing about being a sociopath is never having to say you're sorry. It's quite a thing to say. So what does that mean? It means that the perpetrator may not care. So there's only one thing that people can do to make it work well. And the thing that they can do is give consequences. Whoever is the bully, the perpetrator, needs to have consequences they can realize. Not unlike what's presented in that diagram. Financial consequences are huge. If the perpetrator does not get stopped, they have no reason to stop it because they're trying to avoid possibly the biggest thing they could ever avoid, which is a psychic death. A psychic death is beyond painful. So I think that's something to consider when you're looking at the totality of this. But I think for every person in the legal side, watching the Family Wizard app and how the back and forth goes with the parents, that to me is a critical factor.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.
I'm going to switch it over to Dr. Ramani now for her to share slides, go into some of the nuances a little bit better here. Thanks.
Dr. Ramani, I sent over a mute request for you because you're muted right now. There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Sorry. Once
There
you
we
put the
go.
slides up, everything sort of goes away. So again, welcome. First of all, thank you so much, Jason, for giving me sort of a takeoff ramp here. Thank you, Carly, for organizing this really important conversation. And thank you to all of you who have come to listen, who are listening to on a recording or here present today, that it is, this is an area where there's a lot of finger pointing. Well, the court's not doing it right. The lawyer's not doing it right. The shrink's not doing it right. And I think the only way we're going to push through this, because ultimately the ramifications are hitting children, which is, hitting children at a critical developmental junctures, that we understand this. And so I am going to go over, I can tell you that right now, I am very verbose. I've already told Carly that. So I know that many of you have incredibly important things to do. You'll get the recording. I'm hoping to, sort of pull myself off the stage probably at 45 minutes. So we can start here with this question. Can a person successfully co-parent with a narcissistic person in a way that is in the best interest of the child? It's a rhetorical question, but if I treated this as a probabilistic question, I'm going with probably not. There is the nature of narcissism, as Jason sort of set us up. It's not made for parenting. It's a very egocentric, dysregulated, self-serving style that really doesn't hold space for another person. The challenge then becomes, though, somebody is now having to raise children with this person, and this best interest issue, the reason I'm using that language is I'm very aware of this. This is what judges and anyone involved in family court has to grapple with. The answer to this is probably not. But also we're going to see how sort of thorny this space is in terms of understanding how this plays out in family court. What are, again, as Jason laid out here, is that I'm going to use two terms here. I'm not going to just use the word narcissism. I'm going to use the word antagonism. And there's a reason for that. This word narcissism in some ways has become such a third rail that expanding it to what's actually technically a better term can actually take away some of the zazazoo that narcissism comes that feels so accusatory. Somehow antagonism sort of broadens the lens, and those of us working with litigants, co-litigants in these cases, are telling the parents, use antagonism, don't use the word narcissism. And what the other issue is that you will see a very charming, charismatic, well put together parent show up at a hearing or a trial date or even in a mediation. And the other parent, let's call them the non-narcissistic parent, is almost is like a quivering leaf. They've been abused emotionally for so many years that they often don't look as put together. And it's important to be aware of the why of that, because many times people view the other parent, the not narcissistic parent, the not antagonistic parent, as almost a bit more out of it, and they're not. Above all else, the impact of children, which I'm going to break down. But the fact is, a person with this kind of personality style has to win at all costs. It's essential for their psychological health. If they don't win, then it's almost like they crumble, right? Just as Jason had suggested. So they'll weaponize the procedures of the court. They'll use parenting plans, not for their children, but to punish their co-parent, and then dangle court out there as a way to constantly threaten the other parent who is so wrung out by this process. In most family courts, the guiding premise is the best interest of the child's special, educational, medical, mental health, and other needs. It's a loose standard because those are often almost like sort of baseline things that need to be done, that even in some ways a narcissistic parent could do them, not well, but they could sort of serviceably. It's almost like somebody could put a meal in front of you, but it may not be nourishing. And it doesn't capture how much antagonism undercuts this. And then you have two parents who may very well have differing agendas. One parent is actually trying to protect the children and land on a fair settlement that will allow them to continue to raise their children. The other parent may be vindictive, but where it gets tricky from your seat in the family court is that still that narcissistic parent, even at a superficial level, still is invested in this identity of being a parent. So here's one thing I'd like to do to make everyone's job easier. If I ran the world, and I don't, I barely run my own household, but if I ran the world, I would get rid of this diagnosis tomorrow. This has done more harm than it is doing good, especially recently. And if any of you want to do more further reading in this, I would recommend anything by Alan Francis. He wrote a book called Twilight of American Sanity. It's a bit politicized, but Alan Francis was one of the original drafters of this diagnosis back in 1980 when it first showed up in DSM. That's actually kind of recent. And so the fact is, though, this diagnosis has caused a lot of problems because people are getting themselves, oh, don't diagnose someone you don't know. You can't diagnose your spouse. Don't talk about diagnosis. So let's not. Let's just talk about narcissism or antagonism. Narcissism is a personality style, just like agreeableness is a personality style, and introversion is a personality style, and nobody's getting themselves worked up about someone saying someone's an introvert. But this idea of it sitting in a diagnosis actually makes your job harder, because the fact is that now we're thinking that this is somebody who's carrying a diagnosis, and now we have to actually be aware that this may be a person who has a mental health issue. The prevalence of narcissistic personality disorders may be 1 to 4% in most epidemiological studies. The presence of clinically notable or observable narcissism as a personality style, I'm thinking that's probably closer to 20%. But most folks don't carry the diagnosis, so let's just get rid of that. So let's talk about antagonism. Antagonism is a personality style, personality trait. It's characterized by behaviors, because that's what we can see, puts people at odds with other people. These are folks who have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. They are entitled. They think they're VIPs. They should get special treatment. They have very little empathy. They don't know their own. They're not even in touch with their own needs and feelings, and they don't care about other people's needs and feelings. And they will use other people. They will exploit other people to get what they want. And they're also very hostile. Instead of us talking about narcissism, if we use this as the frame, now we're capturing a much wider diagnostic frame. Some of the terms that Jason was using, like borderline and psychopathy and narcissism, forget all those terms. Let's talk about antagonism, because this is not good. It's not good for parenting. It is not good for the world, and it's certainly not good for a courtroom. Your other problem is that there's different combinations here, okay? In the most common telling, and I think that this is where a lot of the reform need comes from, is you have an antagonistic parent and a healthy parent. This is the phenomenon we typically call sort of classical narcissistic abuse. And it's important that anybody affiliated with family court understands what that looks like. And this means that everybody needs to be trained on these personality issues all around, okay? Where it gets messy is when you have two antagonistic parents. That's almost when you need to wear a splash guard against all of the hostility coming into that room and really sort of say a prayer at night for these children, because it's very volatile. Here, even more than when there's the antagonistic and healthy parent, the singular focus has to be on the child, because at least with the healthy parent, there's at least one holding environment that's good for this child. When it's this combination, it's really about being child-centered. And this will be more obvious. You might see a lot more hostile back and forth, on whether on the app, whether in the courtroom, whether in a mediation room. This will be quite visible to you. And then you might have one antagonistic parent and one parent who's not antagonistic, but maybe more emotionally reactive because of all that's happening. These are the cases where, because that parent is reactive, they may look somewhat antagonistic, but they're not insulting, they're not threatening vindictiveness. They are talking about the kids, but in a very, very sort of emotional way, which we would expect in somebody who's going through trauma and feels like they're under a constant state of threat. Again, the training on personality and trauma is needed by everyone in the court. So you've also got different combinations. This isn't about one person's good and one person's bad. It's not that simple. You have a lot of limits within the court, and I acknowledge that, right? You have mandates around best practices and a goal of equitable custody, and how every situation presents a little bit differently. You don't get to pull out personality tools out of your back pocket. It's very time consuming and very expensive to do personality assessment. And sometimes it's not even as reliable and valid as we want. Only doctoral level folks can use these tools. So a lot of evaluators and folks affiliated with the court, like a social worker, they can't even use these tools. Personality is not an indictment of parenting, right? So if the parent is, you can't say, oh, you're narcissistic, you're a bad parent, you're antagonistic, you're a bad parent. It doesn't work like that. We do have to look at behaviors. Now, again, as a betting gal, I can tell you this right now, the vast majority of people who are antagonistic are not good at parenting. But the lines are often, the behaviors are often under the line, because the charm, the charisma, the sort of coming and looking like they're very well put together can be confusing. So the big issue becomes, for the, I'm going to call them for our purposes here, the non-antagonistic parent, is having enough documentation to make their point. And then the real risk of things like, oh, it's a person scorned, often it's the woman scorned. And without data, I know that a lot of the cases I have worked on, the person says, I'm being told to give data. How, I mean, unless my house was rigged with cameras at all times, I wouldn't have captured all of this. As a court, you also don't get to weigh in on motivation. You can't say, wow, this antagonistic person is out to destroy this person's life. It can look like that, but you as a judge, you as anyone involved in the family court, you don't get to do that. And I understand that. We barely get to do it as therapists. And here's the thing. A lot of this work is driven by anecdote, very, very powerful, gruesome anecdotes. I mean, the kind of stuff that can drive policy, end up on Capitol Hill. And I'll be talking about some of that legislation here. But the fact is, a lot of these people are bringing legitimate concerns. One woman I worked with, her child was being sexually abused by a family member of the narcissistic ex-spouse. She suspected it. The pediatrician even wanted to put in a report. And she was told in an attorney setting, even with that report, she's still looking like the antagonistic parent because her ex-spouse brought up the mythical issue of parental alienation. So this is complicated. In the same breath, though, are there cases where people make false complaints? Absolutely. And you have the unenviable position of having to sort through all of this. By and large, the people who are the non-antagonists who are bringing their complaints have no reason to lie. They're just trying to protect their children. But you're not shrinks. I'm not a judge. I didn't go to law school. I didn't do all the things you did, and you didn't go to grad school or med school. So the other thing is we have to educate anyone who affiliates with the family court or works in the stead of the family court, but we can't expect people to have known this without the kind of training that Dr. Okason has put together here. Keep in mind, too, the United States and Somalia are the only two countries that haven't ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Why? Because of the concern about undermining parents' rights in the United States. It speaks to how loud parental rights are in the United States, and then how much is the court acting in the stead of parental rights versus children's rights. And if it's happening on that global level, I'm pretty sure it's happening in the family courts. But people who've gone and survived narcissistic relationships have endured an experience that, from a nervous system perspective, is on par with physical or sexual domestic violence. We are now teaching, coaching, if you will, our clients how to be in court so they can find a way to present to the court that look at how antagonistic this person is without using the words. Don't say gaslighting, don't say narcissism, don't say psychopath, don't say sociopath, don't say abuse. This is what clients are being told they cannot say in court for fear of being called an alienator or a problem. And when we have words that actually communicate something, and we're being told you're going to have to do this dance, and I teach people how to do that dance, we've got to make these systems a little more transparent, because people are afraid. They're afraid of showing up in court and saying, I was emotionally abused, because they don't want to be referred to as the difficult litigant. And then people are saying, well, then show me the report. Show me a law enforcement department in the United States that's going to take a report on emotional abuse. In 95% of cases, if somebody called law enforcement in the case of an emotional abuse situation, they are not going to send officers out. And if they do, it's just going to be written off as a domestic dispute, and oftentimes no report filed, and often a lot of consternation by the officers. Where are women to go with this? Otherwise, they're reporting it in therapy, but then they face the sort of the mixed blessing of, do I want my therapy records brought into the court record? So it's almost there's nowhere to turn, even if when these patterns are observed, because there's nobody actually to document them. So people are afraid of getting into trouble if they bring up these patterns, these antagonistic patterns in their relationship and say, this is what happened. By the time people leave narcissistic relationships, they have tried everything to make them work. They've been confused for years, if not decades, and they're facing the divorce with tremendous fear, because the messaging is, if you're difficult, you're going to be punished by the system. It's also essential that Evan Stark and other people's work on coercive control be understood. Right now, coercive control legislation is in place in California, Connecticut, and Hawaii. And it is only part of the family law, though in Hawaii, they've expanded its reach. California, it's part of family law. It was brought into family law, I think September of, I think I want to say 2021. But it's a pattern of psychological control and abuse in which a person attempts to control another person through fear and menace. And it's done through all of these mechanisms, I've laid out here: isolation, constant criticism, lots of monitoring, limiting of freedoms, gaslighting, and so on. The challenge is that now with this new legislation, it's now on the courts to actually be able to assess this and bring it into decision making. Like I said, 3 states have now given permission to the courts to bring this in. Because in coercive control cases, there may not be, in many cases, is not physical violence, but rather a constant sense of fear. That has often limited its utility. People are saying that basically these are people who are living in a constant state of contradiction, confusion, and fear. They don't even know what to ask for. And the domestic violence community is still kind of coming up to speed on what coercive control is. It's an essential thing that the family court recognizes, and especially those who are operating in states where this exists as law, to use that now to bring that into decision making. And advocates are working tirelessly to try to bring this into law in all of the other states. The United Kingdom was the forerunner on this and has really expanded the reach of coercive control, even above and beyond family court. It's only part of a civil code. Coercive control is not part of criminal law. The laws are shaped differently in each of these states. But again, folks I know who are working in psychological capacity in the courts are saying they're seeing mixed success because it's relatively new. But it is a tool as long as these patterns can be established and they're being observed in these relationships. When a person is co-parenting with a narcissist, every single day is a challenge for all of these reasons. The non-antagonistic parent will feel undermined, lots of contempt and criticism, boundaries are really loose. There's a lot of moving the goalposts, a lot of game playing, gaslighting. The parent feels a sense of grief. You have to try to avoid getting into the mud because you're constantly being drawn in. Tremendous confusion, like I don't know what to do. A sense of helplessness, hopelessness, exhaustion, having to deal with systems that don't understand what antagonistic abuse or narcissistic abuse looks like. Having to protect children in the midst of this and actually parent them and get the lunches packed and get them to school, and still in many cases be a wage earner. The Gavron warnings are a absolute joy for narcissistic people to quit their jobs, throw Gavron warnings on people who are now trying to raise children who might have been out of the workplace for years. I mean, they really will use every single thing that's out there to punish, not to facilitate growth, but to punish. And this, again, and this is sort of echoing some of what Jason said. Narcissism isn't just the person who's like, I'm so great, aren't I? It's not just pretentiousness. It's not just preening. It's dangerous. Research done by Sophie Kiervik and Brad Bushman, published in 2021 at Ohio State University, probably one of the best meta-analyses on this topic, showed with absolute clarity, narcissism is associated with all forms of aggression. All of the patterns, the entitlement, the grandiosity, all of that are associated with aggression. Direct, indirect, displaced, physical, verbal, bullying offline, bullying online, pick a form of aggression. Narcissism was a consistent associated factor. Bushman's work, 2018, shows it as a risk factor for many things, not just mass shootings, but we also see that there's also a risk of DV perpetration. And so all of these things are related. And so even if the aggression, physical aggression, hasn't happened yet, the likelihood it might happen is high, but also we cannot underestimate the psychological effects of emotional abuse. We criminalize physical abuse. We don't criminalize emotional abuse. That day will come. Not in my lifetime, probably not in many of our lifetimes, but as we learn more about the nervous system and we recognize that the bruises that show in here, if they were on a person's face, everyone would be calling 911. Again, Kiervik and Bushman's article is actually a really important document. It can be brought into policy change in any given state. And what reason I pulled this quote out, because it actually made me sort of ironically chuckle at the time I read it. It's almost, what I love about this is like, no matter what this quote is suggesting, narcissistic people are likely to lash out. It's a very thin-skinned style. There's always a perception of provocation. So if they are not dominating a situation, which they'll attempt to do in court, then they're going to rage against that situation, which actually is a really great tool at the disposal of judges and anyone involved in the court, because if you don't let them dominate, if you don't fall for the charm and charisma, you will see their true colors. Narcissistic abuse is a term that is evolving. It's a problematic term, and if I ran the world, back to the fact that I absolutely don't, it would be called antagonistic relational stress, to capture that larger sort of entire sort of pantheon of antagonistic qualities. It's something different than post-traumatic stress. It's different than complex post-traumatic stress, adjustment disorders, codependency. other words that might be around there floating around, but the two things they can co-locate. You can have a person who's experienced this and these other things. What we got to remember is that this is what happens to any of us, you, me, anyone who's in a relationship like this. We are going to have the fallout I'm about to describe in a moment. And the thing that makes antagonistic relational abuse unique is the capacity of the narcissist to have a very charming, lovely face to the public and rageful behind closed doors. And even within a relationship, there are good days and there are bad days. That's what makes it confusing. If someone was screaming at you 24/7, you're like, this is just a rotten person. This is a lot more complicated. The kinds of patterns we see in narcissistic abuse, the behaviors that occur in these relationships, include a lot of these things: the blame shifting, the need for control, baiting people. That goes back to Jason's example from Batman, right? The Joker almost needed that that zing that he would get from, like, kind of baiting him and getting Batman to react. That right there is the core of the constant antagonism that is these relationships, the devaluing, constant invalidation. I mean, again, if you ever wanted to call me up one day and we could have a conversation about really what the kind of the sort of the bedrock of this looks like. Let me tell you, it ain't pretty. I'm using the word invalidation. It goes a lot deeper than that. There's constant manipulation. The narcissistic person is very skilled at making sure their needs are always met and leaving other people feeling like this is in their best interests. The gaslighting, which is a denial of reality, or certainly a denial of experience, a denial of perception. So it's a bit like lying, but with a twist. The person is also then left to feel as though they're somehow impaired. So it's not as simple as, I didn't say that. It's, I didn't say that. And you know what? I'm beginning to think you have some sort of paranoid issue. You need to see a therapist. So it's the combination of denial, but then on top of that, and there's something wrong with you. When that happens over years, a person feels very, very undermined, and they doubt and blame themselves for what's happening in the relationship. We see intimidation, vindictiveness. We see a phenomenon called future faking, where promises are made down the road and then a complete, I never said that, I never promised that, or wait another year kind of thing. And lots of rage and lots of reactivity. Narcissistic relationships are often kept in place because people are so frightened of the other person's rage. Now, this is very busy, but it's a very, kind of vomity way to tell you what happens to people who are in these relationships. And as you can see, it's not pleasant. The cognitive fallout, it changes the way a person thinks. They feel helpless, they feel hopeless, confused, they feel guilty, they're constantly ruminating. From an interpersonal realm, there's a tremendous sense of loneliness. Like, nobody is ever going to believe this is happening because they're so charming everywhere. A sense of shame. Like, how is this? This is where I am. I'm so embarrassed. And so they'll isolate even further. From a perceptual and arousal perspective, these folks do look, and they have been. It feels very post-traumatic. There's a hypervigilance, a real edginess, a can't kind of sit still. You might even perceive that in your proceedings. They'll seem skittish, and that's a byproduct of this. We'll see shifts in self and identity. These are folks who are riddled with self-doubt and self-blame. And you'll hear that in their languaging, as though they're almost taking on some responsibility for the toxicity that another person engaged in. As Jason said, it takes two, not so much here. It's really one, and the other person constantly running defense. The emotional and affective fallout is anxiety, depression, grief reactions, and it's just a sense of apathy. People almost feel they look depressed when they show up to a therapist in many cases. Behaviorally, these are folks who are constantly trying to appease situations, apologize, avoid. And so as a result, they struggle a lot with the proceedings of going through a divorce. And from a physical and health perspective, we can see pretty significant decrements in a person's health. Right now, I'm working on statistically creating a model around this. So we actually have measurement instruments for this. So that's something else, another tool for the courts. But a really important issue that the courts have to remain aware of. And we're seeing this in high profile celebrity cases all the time, but it has a name, and that's post-separation abuse, a phenomenon that has been documented for over a decade now. It's the abuse that happens after a relationship or a marriage dissolves. And we'll see everything ranging from threats of violence, ongoing emotional abuse, interfering with the process of parenting, stalking, property damage, sort of waiting at workplaces, sitting in cars outside of where a person's having dinner or something like that, manipulating schedules of visitation, discrediting a person in public. This gets often magnified when minor children are involved, and the court is mandating contact because it's basically giving that person a sort of a mandated entry point. Very common in antagonistic perpetrators. Why? Because people with these personality styles have something we call abandonment reactivity. When the relationship ends, they feel abandoned and they lash out. Rejection sensitivity, that sense of vindictiveness that's characteristic of this personality style. Lots of dysregulation and impulsivity. There's not a day that goes by that we do not hear of a homicide perpetrated by somebody who was in a relationship where somebody left someone, and it's typically, it's very gendered, right? Where I'm gonna say approve, I guess, yeah. That a person leaves a relationship and then for safety, and then the perpetrator then will attack will attack, physically abuse, and will often culminate in homicide. That's happening too regularly. And we see that the need for dominations, the need for power is what matters. Then we see these systems failures, right? This is where family court will make accusations of obstruction and will give custody to that antagonistic parent under these post-separation abuse conditions, saying, well, there's a lot of emotion in the room. This is not emotion, this is abuse. And then when a parent is bringing up allegations of post-separation abuse, being called the unfriendly parent. These are the patterns we're looking for, and that have been documented, and the construct has been solidified around this idea of post-separation abuse. I don't know why this is not letting me advance. Someone has turned on some weird annotation, and I don't know how to make that go away. Okay, let me see if I can, okay, why won't this advance? Something happened and someone asked to annotate, and I agreed to that, which I probably shouldn't have. I don't know if I can turn that off. Reading recording is in progress. I'm so sorry about this. I'm not able to advance this slide.
You're completely fine. Yeah. I've never had someone annotate before.
Yeah, whenever it does, it's made a bit of a mess. So let me, here we go. There we go. Done. All right. So what does post-separation abuse do? What does it look like, I should say? It looks like neglectful parenting. It's for a person who's engaging in post-separation abuse will engage in fighting for time just for the sake of equity. So it's like, I deserve my piece. This is mine. There's a real entitlement. I need my part, but it's not thinking about what is good for the child. It's just for equity's sake. It's post-separation abuse involves compromising the support systems that the other partner, the non-antagonistic partner, may have. Harassment, stalking, surveillance. When I work with clients, I tell them, you got to get your house swept. And literally we have like the names of the agencies that can, and this is not what people should need to put their money into. But because of certain requirements around now they can come and pick up the child, they have access to the house. And it's very easy these days. All I have 2 words for you, air tags, to surveil someone. And so it's those are a huge part of post-separation abuse, and obviously legal and financial abuse and the chronic vindictiveness. So we're preparing our clients for this. And I also know I'm at my 30-minute point, but I said I'll go about 15 minutes long. So if anyone has to go, I fully understand, and this will be part of the recording. But we're working with our clients to prepare them for this experience of post-separation abuse. Like I said, getting homes and cars swept, having the house checked for cameras, recording devices and malware. I mean, it is costly, but it's invariably they find something. It's I tell clients to get a new phone. Everything on the old account's got to go. New phone that you bought, that's always in your possession. The expenses of forensic accounting when people are more resourced, and that becomes an issue. Having to be very careful about their social media use, even about it showing their whereabouts or announcing what it is, what they're doing, or who they're with. And that we always reinforce that the parent should not discuss these proceedings with minor children and seek out therapy, even whether children want to go or not, so that the child feels supported and at least has a safe place to talk about what's going on. And what do we teach them? We say, stay calm so the antagonist blows up. That's what we want to have happen. And so that's what we're trying to do, is create that moment of chaos in the courtroom, because it feels like nothing that they're sharing is enough, but it takes that moment where the antagonistic person blows up. Now, here's the bad news. And so far, it seems like, I think, a lot of bad news, but there is bad news, more bad news. These personality styles do not change. Okay. And I think that's part of the problem. And well, Dr. Ramani, you're being defeatist. And how could you say that? I'll tell you how I can say that. Data. There is not a single randomized clinical trial out there that shows any form of treatment utility for people with narcissistic personalities. And when there is case-based literature, where there's a single case, yeah, they share great outcomes, but in essence, it's the story of a unicorn. And the fact is, most people do not have access to the kind of mental health care they would need when they have these kinds of personalities. So even if they're motivated, unless they're really well resourced and have access to one heck of a good therapist, this is not a style that's going to change. So waiting for that, well, let's recommend therapy for them. It's going to take years. And it's going to require commitment and a desire to change and insight. That's a lot of ands and ifs. So we don't have that. That's not going to happen. So we're working with the antagonistic mess in front of us. We're not even training graduate students on this. Most graduate programs don't have a 1-semester class on personality disorders or personality, let alone on narcissism. So people are coming out and having to use a cobbling together of continuing ed to figure it out. So it's naive to think that we would believe that court systems or people even affiliated with court systems would understand this. So many of our systems, including criminal justice, are focused on punishment and not prevention. And so what happens is that the damage that happens in these relationships happens because a person is emotionally broken down over many, many years. So this is not the one lashing out and there's a physical injury and there can be arrest. When we're trying to do prevention work around personality, the way the laws and our Constitution are written in this country, it's all but impossible. So we're always fixing these messes on the back end. These patterns are societally enabled. Narcissistic and antagonistic people, the research shows, they make more money and they're more represented in leadership. So they be making the decisions too, and they have more money, so they're more societally legitimized. And it's really hard to do this longitudinal research. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We can get through everything. But some of the things that people, judges, mediators, people working with couples where there's a narcissistic or antagonistic person, they'll say things like, the two of you should be able to sit together and figure out a plan. I'm sure you both have the best interests of your child at heart. Can you put your differences aside for a moment? When these things are said, the non-antagonistic person literally feels as though they're having a breakdown because they've been trying to do this for many, many, many years. So when that's being put out there as a solution, then the person recognizes how hopeless this is, because these things are not going to happen. So they really are not meaningful suggestions in these cases. So if these patterns are becoming manifest, these suggestions actually do more harm than good. Because what's happening is you're treating the non-antagonistic person as though they're psychologically wired similarly to the narcissistic person. You want to be, from a parenting plan development perspective, some of the issues you want to remain aware of, to make sure that the stipulations around healthcare decision making, especially mental health care, are written in a way that they cannot be co-opted by the antagonistic parent. Many times the antagonistic parent tries to block mental health care. They don't want the child to have that, or who knows what they're afraid of, or maybe it's just to aggravate the other parent. but be very aware of how that's written in these cases. Stipulations around things like the introduction of new partners. Antagonistic people very quickly move into new relationships, often getting engaged the day after they leave, and they'll try to fight for things like bifurcation so they can get into new relationships. This is confusing as hell for children. These kinds of things can be built into a parenting plan. At least it gives some heft to putting the children first, because children are rendered really uncomfortable by all of this. Many times the antagonistic person, you can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me who to date. It's not that. You can go date whoever you want, but it's about how quickly minor children are introduced to these new partners. Obviously, the use of parenting apps, just Talking Parents or My Family Wizard, is critical. And then enforcing the stipulation of no outside communication outside of the use of the apps. Narcissistic, antagonistic folks don't like being told what to do, and they don't like being told to use the apps. There has to be clear policies in the parenting plan around compensatory time, because antagonistic people are often trying to change things at the last minute, if not just to aggravate the other co-parent, and just it's almost like they want to be in control of the narrative. Sometimes they're just careless and late, but then they'll feel entitled to time and say, oh, I missed this weekend, so I get Thanksgiving. It doesn't quite work that way. That stuff needs to be put into a parenting plan with an almost excruciating level of clarity, to at least give the non-antagonistic parent a leg to stand on. The looser the parenting plan, the worse this is for people in these situations. You want to avoid minimizing the non-antagonistic parent's concerns. They're scared and decide, oh, come on, these are your kids. Really? It's not that. It is, for the narcissistic person, they're so involuted, they're so focused on themselves. It's really quite remarkable how much they'll do that conceivably could harm a child. And I don't even think in most cases the antagonistic person is setting out to harm their child. I think they're so focused on vindictiveness that the child becomes collateral damage. So it's really important that those concerns of that non-antagonistic parent aren't minimized. The non-narcissistic parent is not being neurotic when they're asking for every I to be dotted and T to be crossed on this parenting agreement. They're simply so worried about the narcissistic parent finding the loopholes. And this is not a one and done parenting plan. This is an evolving document. It's going to evolve as children get older, as schools change, as activities change. And these are folks who will often be frequent flyers in these systems, because sadly they don't have a choice. The kinds of gambits that antagonistic people bring into the court. These are things like Gavron warnings, for pushing people back into employment that don't make sense. For example, there may be the need to stay home with a child with special needs, and employment could actually mean that there wouldn't even be enough money to pay an adequate caregiver. Or I've worked with folks. In one case, a woman had been out of the workforce for 25 years. She was 62 years old at the time of the divorce, hadn't worked in 25 years, cancer survivor, massive neuropathy, and the narcissistic ex-partner was trying to push a Gavron warning, and the judge was hearing it, and it was sheer madness. Intentionally, narcissistic people leave their employment and try to cut their wages so that they have to pay out less. They'll try to horse trade for more time, and the other parent will capitulate. So they'll try stunts like, you want me to pay their tuition? Well, the bill's due tomorrow, so I want them at Thanksgiving because I'm going to have my new girlfriend there. So when the parent only wants to keep their child in school, they certainly are not going to be seen by the court within 24 hours. And these are the kinds of stunts that are being played. And many times these folks will show up at court and say this was happening, and then we'll be told, well, why did you let that happen? Because they were desperate. You'll see things like hiding assets. Narcissistic and antagonistic folks will often not cooperate with discovery. They will attempt to subpoena therapy records, and we all fight hard to not let that happen. And the recommendation of mediation simply doesn't work in these cases. The vast majority of mediators they're trying to mediate, right? And there's really no mediation in these circumstances. And so that's why many cases, people in these antagonistic situations are not mediating, not because they're trying to be difficult, but because this is not going to work. And the final piece I'm going to speak about very briefly, because this is not my area of expertise, is this entire idea of parental alienation. This is one of the most hot button issues out there. The construct has not been clearly defined, and the terminology has been called into question by people who are working as legal advocates and law professors, most notably Joan Meyer at George Washington Law School. The problem is the word by itself, alienation with a small a, it means what it means. Alienation with a capital A that's been brought in, and people are trying to argue that it's a syndrome or something that actually belongs in diagnostic manuals. What's happening is that this idea, this concept of alienation is being mobilized when typically the non-antagonistic parent will say there was domestic abuse in this relationship, there was emotional abuse. Alienation is then given as the counter accusation. And they're saying, look, he or she, usually it's she is turning the child against me by saying I was a domestic abuser. I was a sexual abuser, even when there's documentation. What happens then is that then it's a form of gaslighting. The parent who has the longstanding history of being emotionally abused will be called mentally unstable. And then the parent, the non-antagonistic parent, will say, I'm really worried about my child's safety with the other parent. That gets framed as alienation. So this is a war. Right now, this is a war that two groups are fighting. So when this term comes into the courtroom, a far better stance would to say, stop using these words and break it down into behaviors. I need to see what's happening here instead of it being just viewed as a one-off, like this is alienation, because the literature is not supporting that construct in its form. Caden's Law was added to the Violence Against Women Act. It was done in the last year or two because Biden signed the legislation. It incentivizes states. This is now a state-by-state law. They're attempting to get it into federal legislation, but incentivizes states to ensure that their child custody laws adequately protect at-risk children by doing these three things: restricting expert testimony to only people who are appropriately qualified to provide it. And in this case would often mean people who literally only have that expertise in understanding antagonistic relationships, in domestic violence, in trauma, in child abuse. And that this can only be done when there is that expertise, because right now it's like people are bringing in hired guns who often have other political agendas. The second is to limit the use of things like reunification camps and therapies, which do not have any evidence base about being successful, because there is no reunification treatment should be issued by the court without scientifically valid and accepted proof of safety and efficacy. And the third is to provide evidence-based ongoing training to judges, so here we are, on family violence, including all of the above. So in fact, what Dr. Okeson has created is consistent with what is being attempted through Caden's Law, which I said it's a state's law at this point, it's still not in federal. And as a few last issues, some primary issues to remember: nobody's getting trained, especially key players such as GALs and evaluators. We also need GALs to have more training. Right now, in many states, it's 20 hours. That's not enough for that kind of, we're devaluing children when we do that. Things like 730 evaluations and the need for evaluators of all kinds to be familiar with personality issues as these custody decisions are being made. There may be, and I think in a lot of the antagonism cases, you're talking about ongoing reevaluation. Do the courts have the money and the resource to do this? No. Everyone talks a big game about, we want to protect children. Well, this would be one heck of a great place to put that resource. We need better assessment, and the problem is it's very hard to do because you cannot necessarily coerce people or force people into personality assessment. People have to understand the reality of how trauma affects the nervous system, how that relates to how people report their experiences with domestic violence. These are people who are confused. Just because they didn't report it doesn't mean it didn't happen. We have to be also very careful in courtroom settings to not view these people who are reporting, non-antagonistic people in these relational settings, who are reporting their abuse, as being problematic, recognizing what emotional abuse and coercive control are, and also being very aware of case-specific issues especially with children who have special medical, psychosocial, or educational needs. Those children often, when there's a lot of backing and forthing and toing and froing, the disruption's bad for any child. For children living with some of these special needs, it can actually be quite dangerous. And you know what? One of the most important things, if all you take out of this is that you avoid shame and blame. Survivors will often have to live forever with, I made a bad choice. I made this mess. I got into a relationship. I got married to this person and I gave my kids this terrible parent. That will be a lifetime of devastation and grief. But many reasons, for many of them, they were survivors of these patterns from childhood. They may have grown up, experienced adverse childhood experiences. They may have watched parents with a terrible relationship. There may be cultural or religious reasons, financial reasons, social class issues. It's very complicated. And they continue to feel blamed, like I know I made a bad choice. And then they're punished for a lifetime. The court cannot clean up their mess. They know that the court can't completely clean it up. And I work with clients on realistic expectations, that there's only so much that can be done with the limits of the law. But you would be shocked at how far empathy and simple recognition of what's happening in front of you, of somebody who is seeking out, is being vindictive and cruel, and it's right there on Family Wizard or Talking Parents on the app, of how atrocious that behavior is that these survivors have been living under a state of shame and blame, sometimes for a lifetime. I think that the family court should not be one more place that happens. So there's me, and if I can, really for me, the real challenge here is cooperating with this. There we go. Video. There we go. So I went over 17 minutes, not bad, Carly. I told you it would be 15, so I'm
No.
within normal limits. So thank you for your attention.
Yes. Thank you so much, both of you. You did such a great job. It's a complicated subject, but I think being able to view it in this way and hear a little bit more background was so helpful. So thank you, both of you. And thanks everyone for staying and participating. We do have 2 questions, great questions on the Q&A that I'll read aloud. And if you guys want to answer it. So the first one is, how do we as attorneys assist our clients to deal with the narcissist? This will not be enough to suspend visits. We just have to give them tools to deal with and protect the children as much as is possible.
Do you care who you, I mean, I would say above all else as attorneys, to validate, don't minimize, show empathy. But I think for the attorneys too, I'm very, very aware of how almost this can actually be really challenging for the attorneys, who can sometimes feel quite helpless in these cases too. So I'm even going to say there has to be a certain modicum of self-care for the attorneys and judges who are hearing these cases, because the frustration is it's devastating. And so, but I think that one of the errors I've seen many attorneys make is like, oh, come on, it's not going to be that bad. I can sit here and tell you it's going to be that bad. And I think that you validate, this is real, this is happening, I hear you, encourage them, you're doing a great job under the circumstances, prepare them, put them through, like actually grill them. I found that, and I know there's cost associated with that, but, actually work with them and, do a pseudo deposition. Another thing I would also suggest, in cases, if your client is amenable to it, and I've done this many times, consider getting on a call. If they're working with a therapist who gets all of this and has been a good source of support for them, it can sometimes be helpful to do a call with, again, everyone has to sign the appropriate releases and all the paperwork and HIPAA and all of that. But if they agree, can sometimes be very helpful for the attorney to hear from the client's counselor or psychologist, who can say, let me, give you a bigger picture here. And so that can be useful too. But I think more than anything, validate, don't minimize, don't ever gaslight your client, recognize this is probably going to be worse than they expected, but also encourage them and help them, and recognize that this is going to be a process. It's, like I said, it's not a one and done. We're divorced, parenting plan, let's go off into the sunset. It's an ongoing process until these children are no longer minors.
It's a great answer. I think if the attorney the legal person really understands the depths of the disorder and the traits, they can really help the client to not personalize, which is really what I think a lot of people suffer through. They personalize, did I do something wrong? And the abuse is directed to them. So it's hard to separate that, to say, well, why wouldn't I personalize it? It is actually about me. They have to, the client really has to understand that this is the only way out for the perpetrator, and work to lower the volume, the boom of that abuse, which is not easy. It's a real art.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. And then the next question is, how should litigants and their attorneys proceed if the judge is a narcissistic personality?
Yeah, that's a whole, I was trying to be nice and not bring that piece up. So I'm glad someone brought it in a question, because listen, there's not a profession out there, you name it, that we're not going to see these kinds of personality styles in. It is a tough one, because at that point you might be having the same dynamics that are replicated in the relationship, the antagonistic relationship, now with the judge, right? And so I think that more than anything is having as many of your ducks in line as possible becomes crucial. A good attorney will be able to read how much the judge is allowing that conversation to actually account for these antagonistic patterns and do the dance accordingly. But if they feel that they're being stonewalled by a judge, or there's no willingness to hear personality issues, documentation then starts becoming the only, almost one of the only tools that you've got. What you don't want to do is get into the mud with the judge. It's no different than getting into any narcissistic person. You don't want to get into the mud with the antagonistic part. You don't want to get in the mud with any antagonistic person. You're never going to win that battle. And it could really make the situation much, much worse. And so it's that painful agony of respecting the situation, respecting the setting of the courtroom, bringing forth the documentation. Again, I am not a judge, I'm not an attorney, so I am not sure what options are available for a person to have the case reassigned. Obviously, that would be optimal, is to lift it away from that person to someone else. But I don't know. Again, I don't understand. I'm sure that those vary probably jurisdiction to jurisdiction on how much that can happen. But I think it's, what you don't want to do is, that's not the hill to die on. It's really like, if you can get this reassigned, great. And it's also just like a person has to in these relationships, they have to have very realistic expectations, and then figure out what tools would work, for example, like data. Those are the things you want to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's great. And we actually have another last question. Any advice for situations where the custody evaluator or psychologist has been duped by the narcissist and attacks the non-antagonistic party?
Wow, it's almost worse than the judge question. That's a really tough one. I think this is where you have to really remain calm. And then it's where you have to be practical and not emotional, and use skills. Like they say in dialectical behavior therapy, you need to use your skills. In the case of the judge, what do you do if the judge seems to be, quote, narcissistic, or narcissistic personality disorder? Make them feel like they're the greatest thing on earth, because you're going to play to their narcissism, which may actually be the one way to work your way out of it. It may not work either. There could be a problem, but it's certainly going antagonistic is probably not going to help. So the quick bite on this one is, I think you have to remain calm and figure out how you're going to plan to get a switch if you can, because yes, some people are easily duped by the charming narcissist, for lack of a better term.
So when it comes to custody evaluation, though, and if you have somebody who has been charmed, again, this is going to vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction, whether there's an opportunity to get an additional evaluation, which, like I said, people who start asking for these additional things, they're often viewed as the problem. That's one of the struggles we're having, if you can get that, wonderful. If you can't, you're back to documentation. I mean, in realistic expectations. That's the issue, though, is that the custody evaluators do not have training on these issues. They don't. And I hate to be cynical, but in order for a custody evaluator to get hired again, they can't keep saying like, well, this is a complicated case and this, because anytime there's any variance off of what both parties want or equitable custody divisions, that's just making the court has to work a lot harder in those cases. So I think that you have this training issue, but if they're trained, then they're not going to be as easily played. They're going to be able to see it and really, really, again, put together the documentation, the other patterns that are really manifest in these situations. Folks, I'm not saying this is easy. Especially like I said, at the top of my talk, I was saying sometimes this is two antagonistic parents, right? And so I do not envy the judges and the attorneys who are having to day in and day out hear these cases and wonder what's going on. But there has to be some room built in for these personalities are a thing, but above all else, they don't change. So this big sort of shiny hope that this is all going to work its way out, it's not ever going to work its way out. And these children are suffering day in and day out with this. As somebody who works with the adult survivors, the people who went through these custody battles as kids, the kids who went through this narcissistic abuse as kids, working with them as adults, I can't tell you how horrific this legacy is. And it's not right that family courts would be contributing to what this legacy is. And that's the real challenge here is as there's more training and more expectation that custody evaluators get this, then and only then are we going to see those changes. I mean, we're getting it on TV. We can see the slick person on a TV show. That's got to happen in all kinds of workplace settings, including in custody evaluations.
Wonderful, wonderful answers. Thank you so much, everyone. We do have, this was a great talk. I hope everyone learned a good amount and can apply it to their own courtroom practices. I want to thank you both so much for coming.